The fluorescent lights of the Fort Carson mess hall cast their familiar harsh glow across rows of metal tables where soldiers in ACUs sat hunched over their evening meals. The constant hum of conversation, clinking utensils, and occasional laughter created a backdrop that Master Sergeant William Henderson had grown accustomed to over 3.5 decades of military service. Bill sat alone at his usual corner table, mechanically spooning beef stew into his mouth while reading a worn paperback novel. At 58, his grey hair was cropped military short, and deep lines etched his weathered face like a roadmap of hard-earned experience. His uniform bore the subtle indicators of rank and service, the subdued Master Sergeant chevrons, a combat patch from the 10th Mountain Division, and ribbons that most soldiers would recognize if they bothered to look closely. But most didn't look closely at Bill Henderson. To the younger soldiers, he was just another lifer counting down his days until retirement. His quiet demeanor and preference for solitude made him nearly invisible in the social ecosystem of the base. He never raised his voice, never threw his weight around, and never demanded the deference his rank typically commanded. He simply did his job, trained his soldiers with patient precision, and kept to himself. The Colorado evening was crisp outside, with early autumn painting the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and amber. Inside the mess hall, the usual cast of characters played out their nightly routines. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was holding court with a group of NCOs near the coffee station, regaling them with stories from her recent deployment to Poland. A table of fresh-faced privates from basic training talked loudly about weekend plans in Colorado Springs. And at a table near the center of the room, 4 soldiers were having a different kind of conversation. Private First Class Jake Morrison, 22 years old and built like a linebacker, was the unofficial leader of the group. He'd been at Fort Carson for 8 months and had developed what he considered a reputation as someone not to mess with. His buddies, Privates Danny Chen, Marcus Williams, and Tyler Brooks, looked up to him, despite all being roughly the same age and rank. "You see that old-timer over there?" Jake nodded toward Bill's corner table while stabbing at his meatloaf. "Been watching him for weeks. Guy just sits there like he's invisible." Danny Chen, a wiry kid from San Francisco, glanced over. "Sergeant Henderson? What about him?" "Look at him," Jake continued, his voice carrying just loud enough to be heard over the ambient noise. "Reading his little book, not talking to anybody. Guys like that think they're better than everyone else. Too good to socialize with the rest of us." Marcus Williams, a former high school football player from Texas, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe he just likes to read, man." "Nah." Jake shook his head, his jaw set with the kind of stubborn certainty that comes from youth and inexperience. "I've seen his type before. Thinks because he's got some rank and some time in, he doesn't have to associate with us regular soldiers. Probably never even seen combat." Tyler Brooks, the youngest of the group at 19, looked between his friends and the solitary figure in the corner. Something about the older soldier's bearing struck him as familiar. It reminded him of his grandfather, who had served in Vietnam but never talked about it. But peer pressure was a powerful force, and Jake's confidence was infectious. "So, what are you thinking?" Danny asked, though there was a note of caution in his voice. Jake's smile held no warmth. "I'm thinking it's time someone taught the old man about respect, about how things work around here." He stood up, his substantial frame casting a shadow across the table. "You guys coming?" The mess hall continued its normal rhythm as the 4 young soldiers made their way across the room. Bill sensed their approach before he looked up from his book, a thriller by Lee Child that he'd read at least 3 times before. Decades of combat and training had honed his situational awareness to a razor's edge, even in seemingly safe environments. He closed the book slowly and set it beside his tray, his movements deliberate and calm. When he looked up, his pale blue eyes met Jake's gaze with a steadiness that might have given a wiser person pause. "Evening," Bill said simply, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had breathed too much desert sand and diesel smoke over the years. The 4 recruits formed a loose semicircle around his table, and Bill could see the dynamics immediately. Jake was the leader, feeding off his own bravado. Danny and Tyler looked uncertain. Marcus seemed to be going along reluctantly. It was a pattern he'd seen countless times before, in different contexts, with stakes ranging from playground confrontations to life-and-death situations in hostile territory. "Sergeant Henderson," Jake said, his tone carrying a mock formality that was clearly intended as disrespect. "We've been watching you, sitting here all alone, night after night. Not very sociable, are you? Bill took a sip of his coffee. Black, no sugar, a habit formed in forward operating bases where luxuries were scarce, and regarded the four young men with the patience of someone who had seen this movie before. The mess hall around them continued its normal evening rhythm, but he could sense the subtle shift in attention. Conversations became quieter, and peripheral vision began to focus on their corner. "I'm sociable enough," Bill replied evenly. "Just prefer my books to most conversation." Jake's laugh was harsh and artificial. "That's the problem, isn't it? Think you're too good for the rest of us. Too educated, too sophisticated." He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Let me tell you something, old man. This is our mess hall, our base. You want to eat here, you need to show some respect to the soldiers who actually matter." Danny Chen shifted uncomfortably behind Jake, his instincts telling him this was heading in a bad direction. He'd grown up in a tough neighborhood in San Francisco, and he recognized the signs of a situation spiraling out of control. "Maybe we should..." "Should what?" Jake cut him off without turning around. His eyes remained fixed on Bill, searching for signs of fear or submission. "Should let this fossil think he can just ignore us, pretend we don't exist." Tyler Brooks took a half step back, his earlier enthusiasm evaporating. Something about the older soldier's stillness was unsettling. Most people, when confronted by four younger, larger men, would show some sign of nervousness, fidgeting, raised voice, defensive posturing. Bill Henderson showed none of these signs. He sat with the relaxed alertness of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. "Son," Bill said quietly, and there was something in his tone, not threatening but absolutely certain, that made Jake's jaw tighten. "You're making assumptions based on incomplete information. That's a dangerous habit." "Dangerous?" Jake's voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from nearby tables. "Are you threatening me, Sergeant?" Bill shook his head slowly. "Not threatening. Advising." He took another sip of coffee. "See, I've been in this army since before you were born. I've seen a lot of young soldiers who confused aggression with strength, noise with authority. Most of them learned better, eventually." Marcus Williams found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. "We're just talking, man, no big deal." "No," Bill said, looking at Marcus with what might have been approval. "You're just talking. Your friend here is doing something else entirely." His gaze shifted back to Jake. "The question is whether he's smart enough to recognize when he's stepped into something he doesn't understand." The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Jake's face reddened, and his hands clenched into fists. Around them, the mess hall had grown noticeably quieter. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had stopped her storytelling and was watching with the focused attention of an NCO trying to decide whether to intervene. Several other soldiers had turned in their chairs, sensing the tension. "You think I don't understand?" Jake's voice was tight with anger. "I understand plenty. I understand that you're some worn-out has-been who's forgotten what it means to be a soldier. I understand that respect goes both ways and you haven't earned any from us." Bill set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. The small clink of ceramic on metal seemed unnaturally loud in the growing silence. When he stood up, he did so with the fluid economy of movement that comes from decades of physical training and combat experience. At 6 feet tall, he wasn't particularly imposing by modern military standards, but there was something in his bearing that made Jake take an involuntary step backward. "Respect," Bill said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet mess hall, "isn't something you demand, Private. It's something you earn through service, sacrifice, and looking out for the soldiers in your charge." He gestured toward the ribbons on his chest, a subtle movement that most of the watching soldiers understood immediately. "These represent 35 years of earning that respect, one day at a time." Danny Chen's eyes widened as he finally focused on Bill's uniform. The Combat Infantryman Badge, the Bronze Star, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal with 3 service stars, the Purple Heart. Jake might not recognize military decorations, but Danny had grown up in a military family. He knew what he was looking at. "Jake," Danny said urgently, tugging at his friend's sleeve. "Jake, maybe we should..." But Jake was too far committed to back down now. His pride was on the line in front of half the mess hall, and he couldn't see past his own wounded ego. "I don't care what ribbons you've got, old man. That was then. This is now. And right now you're nothing but a short-timer who thinks his shit doesn't stink." The watching soldiers held their collective breath. Several senior NCOs had quietly positioned themselves closer to the confrontation, ready to intervene if necessary. But something in Bill's demeanor suggested that intervention might not be needed. Bill looked at Jake for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile or a challenging one. It was the patient, almost sad smile of a teacher watching a student make an expensive mistake. 45 seconds, he said quietly. What? Jake blinked, thrown off by the non sequitur. In 45 seconds, Private Morrison, you're going to understand exactly why your friends there are trying to get your attention. You're going to realize that you've made a serious error in judgment, and you're going to have to decide whether you're man enough to acknowledge it. Jake's confusion quickly morphed back into anger. What the hell are you talking about, old man? You trying to mess with my head? Bill remained perfectly still, his pale blue eyes never leaving Jake's face. I'm talking about the fact that you didn't do your homework before you decided to start this conversation. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, even when speaking quietly. You saw an older soldier sitting alone and made assumptions about what that meant. I see a has-been who, Jake started, but Bill held up a single finger, a gesture so commanding that Jake actually stopped mid-sentence. Private Morrison, Bill said, and now there was steel in his voice. You have about 30 seconds left before this becomes a lesson you'll remember for the rest of your career. I suggest you use them wisely. Danny Chen was frantically trying to get Jake's attention, pointing at Bill's ribbons, but Jake's tunnel vision was complete. Marcus Williams had gone pale, finally recognizing some of the decorations on Bill's chest. Tyler Brooks was looking around the mess hall, suddenly aware that every senior NCO in the place was watching them, with expressions ranging from amusement to concern. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez pushed back from her table and started walking toward them, her expression grim. She'd served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and she knew exactly who Master Sergeant Henderson was, even if these knuckleheads didn't. 20 seconds, Bill said conversationally. You're crazy, Jake sputtered, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Something about the absolute certainty in the older man's demeanor was finally penetrating his anger. 10 seconds, Bill continued, pulling out his phone with deliberate slowness. And here we are. He tapped the screen twice and held it up so everyone could see. The screen showed a group photo of soldiers in desert camouflage, standing in front of an American flag. But this wasn't just any group photo. It was clearly taken in a combat zone, with armored vehicles visible in the background, and the 1,000-yard stare that comes from months in hostile territory visible in every face. This was taken in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan in 2018, Bill said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent mess hall. 3rd tour. I was 49 years old, which made me the old man of the unit even then. Jake's mouth opened, but no words came out. He was staring at the photo, where a younger-looking but unmistakably recognizable Bill Henderson stood in the center of the group, wearing the subdued rank insignia of a master sergeant and carrying the weathered look of someone who had seen too much combat. The soldier on my right there, Bill continued, zooming in slightly, is Staff Sergeant James Rodriguez, 26 years old at the time, 2 kids back home in Texas. He looked up at Jake, whose face had gone from red to pale in a matter of seconds. He stepped on an IED 3 clicks outside Forward Operating Base Chapman on March 15, 2018, lost both legs below the knee. The silence in the mess hall was now complete. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their cleaning to listen. The soldier on my left is Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, single mother of 3. She took shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade while we were evacuating civilians from a compound that Taliban fighters had booby-trapped. Bill's voice remained steady, but there was something in his eyes that made everyone listening understand they were hearing about real people, real friends. She spent 4 months in Walter Reed Army Medical Center, still walks with a limp. Danny Chen had tears in his eyes, finally understanding the magnitude of their mistake. Marcus Williams was staring at his boots, his face burning with shame. Tyler Brooks looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, but Bill wasn't finished. You want to know what those ribbons mean, Private Morrison? Bill tapped his chest lightly. The Bronze Star was for pulling a wounded Afghan interpreter out of a burning vehicle while under fire. The Purple Heart was for the shrapnel I took in my shoulder during that same engagement. The Combat Infantryman badge represents 3 tours in Afghanistan, 37 months total in combat zones. Jake's hands had fallen to his sides, and he was staring at Bill with a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. But you know what I'm most proud of? Bill asked, his voice softening slightly. Not a single soldier under my command died on my watch. Not one. Because I learned a long time ago that real leadership isn't about making noise or demanding respect. It's about putting the mission and your people before yourself, every single day. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had stopped her approach, recognizing that Bill had the situation well in hand. Around the mess hall, soldiers were looking at each other with new understanding, many of them realizing they'd been eating next to a genuine war hero for months without knowing it. Bill put his phone back in his pocket and looked at each of the 4 young men in turn. Now, Private Morrison, you said something earlier about how respect goes both ways, and how I haven't earned any from you. His smile was sad, but not unkind. The truth is, son, I've been earning respect since before you were born. The question is whether you're mature enough to recognize it when you see it. The mess hall remained frozen in silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. Jake Morrison stood there with his mouth slightly open, his face cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light. Confusion, embarrassment, shame, and something that might have been the first glimmer of genuine respect. It was Danny Chen who broke the spell. He stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Master Sergeant Henderson, I'm sorry. We didn't know. Bill's expression softened, and he nodded slightly. Of course you didn't know, son. I don't advertise it. He gestured toward the other tables in the mess hall. Half the soldiers in this room have stories they don't tell. Combat veterans who've seen things that would give you nightmares. Medics who've saved lives under fire. Engineers who've cleared IEDs from playgrounds where children were supposed to be safe. Tyler Brooks found his voice, though it cracked slightly when he spoke. Why do you keep it to yourself? Bill sat back down at his table, his movements as deliberate and controlled as they had been throughout the entire confrontation. Because the ribbons aren't for show, Private Brooks. They represent moments when good soldiers did what needed to be done, often at great personal cost. You don't wear them to impress people at dinner. You wear them to remember the people who didn't make it home. Marcus Williams stepped closer to the table. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. The soldiers in that photo, are they? Some made it home whole, Bill said quietly. Some didn't. Some came back with wounds you can see, others with wounds that are harder to spot. He looked directly at Marcus. But every one of them served with honor, and every one of them deserves respect. Not because they demanded it, but because they earned it through sacrifice. Jake Morrison was still standing there like a statue, apparently unable to process what had just happened. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached the table slowly, her expression a mixture of respect and mild amusement. Master Sergeant Henderson, she said formally, is everything all right here? Bill looked up at her and nodded. Just having a conversation with some young soldiers about the nature of respect, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. I think we're making progress. Rodriguez looked at the 4 privates, her expression making it clear that their behavior hadn't gone unnoticed by the NCO Corps. I see. Well, if you need any assistance with your educational discussion, please let me know. That won't be necessary, Bill said. I believe these soldiers are smart enough to learn from their mistakes. He looked at Jake directly. Aren't you, Private Morrison? Jake finally seemed to shake himself out of his trance. When he spoke, his voice was completely different from the aggressive, arrogant tone he'd used earlier. Yes, Master Sergeant. We were way out of line. I apologize. Don't apologize to me, Bill said firmly. I'm not the one you disrespected. You disrespected every soldier in this mess hall who's ever put their life on the line for their country. You disrespected the uniform you're wearing and the oath you took when you enlisted. The words hit Jake like physical blows, and his shoulders sagged under the weight of understanding. Around them, conversations were slowly resuming, but many soldiers were still glancing in their direction, clearly aware that something significant had just taken place. Danny Chen cleared his throat hesitantly. Master Sergeant, is there something we can do to make this right? Bill studied the 4 young men for a long moment, his pale blue eyes seeming to look right through them. Finally, he picked up his book and tapped it lightly against the table. You want to make it right? He asked. Then you learn from this. You remember that every soldier has a story, and most of those stories involve more sacrifice than you can imagine. You stop judging people by what you think you see on the surface. He stood up again, gathering his tray and his book. And you start acting like the professional soldiers you're supposed to be. This uniform means something. The flag on your shoulder means something. Don't dishonor either one by acting like thugs in a school cafeteria. Tyler Brooks stepped forward slightly. Master Sergeant, would you mind if we sat with you sometime? Maybe you could tell us about real soldiering. For the first time since the confrontation began, Bill's smile reached his eyes. I'd be honored, Private Brooks, but understand real soldiering isn't about war stories and glory. It's about duty, discipline, and taking care of the people in your charge. It's about being ready to sacrifice everything for something bigger than yourself. Jake Morrison finally found his voice again, and when he spoke, it was with a humility that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him an hour earlier. Master Sergeant Henderson, I want you to know, this won't happen again. Not from us, and not from anyone else, if we can help it. Bill nodded approvingly. That's a good start, Private Morrison, but words are easy. It's actions that matter. Show me through your behavior, not your promises. As Bill walked toward the exit, carrying his tray to the cleanup station, the 4 young soldiers stood there processing what had just happened. The mess hall around them had returned to its normal rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. Not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed the quiet dignity with which Master Sergeant Henderson had handled the situation. Danny Chen looked at his friends, his voice barely audible. Guys, we almost got ourselves kicked out of the army tonight. Marcus Williams nodded grimly. We're lucky he didn't have us written up for disrespect to an NCO. Hell, we're lucky he didn't just kick our asses. He could have, Tyler Brooks said quietly, watching Bill's retreating figure. You saw how he moved, how he carried himself. Guy's probably forgotten more about fighting than we'll ever know. Jake Morrison was the last to speak, and when he did, his voice was full of something none of them had ever heard from him before. Genuine remorse. We need to be better, all of us. We need to be the kind of soldiers he'd be proud to serve with. As they walked slowly back to their own table, each of them was thinking about the lesson they'd just learned. It wasn't just about respecting veterans or understanding military decorations. It was about the difference between demanding respect and earning it, between making noise and showing strength, between acting tough and being a true warrior. Outside the mess hall windows, the Colorado evening was settling into full darkness, the Rocky Mountains forming a jagged silhouette against the star-filled sky. But inside, 4 young soldiers had just learned something that would stay with them for the rest of their military careers and the rest of their lives. The next morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only a Colorado dawn can provide. The Rocky Mountains stood like sentinels against the pale sky, their peaks touched with the first golden light of sunrise. But inside the barracks at Fort Carson, the usual morning routine carried an undercurrent of whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Word travels fast in a military installation, especially when it involves a confrontation in the mess hall witnessed by dozens of soldiers. By 0600 hours, 3 different versions of the previous night's events had already made their way through the grapevine, each one growing slightly in the telling. Private First Class Jake Morrison lay in his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling tiles he'd memorized over the past 8 months. Sleep had been elusive, his mind replaying the encounter with Master Sergeant Henderson over and over. Each time he remembered his own words, worn out has been, short-timer who thinks his shit doesn't stink, his stomach clenched with a fresh wave of shame. In the bunk next to him, Danny Chen was already up, quietly folding his PT uniform with the precision their drill sergeants had beaten into them during basic training. He glanced over at Jake, recognizing the signs of a sleepless night in his friend's bloodshot eyes. "So you okay, man?" Danny whispered, mindful of the other soldiers still sleeping around them. Jake sat up slowly, running his hands through his hair. "No," he said simply. "I'm not okay. Danny, what we did last night, what I did," he shook his head. "My grandfather served in Korea, never talked about it much, but I remember the way people looked at him when he wore his uniform to community events, like he was somebody special." Danny nodded, understanding exactly what Jake meant. "My dad always told me that the soldiers who've been through real shit are usually the quietest ones about it." 2 bunks down, Tyler Brooks was pretending to be asleep, but listening to every word. He'd grown up in a small town in Montana, where military service was respected above almost everything else. His own father had served in the First Gulf War, and Tyler had enlisted partly to honor that tradition. The thought that he'd participated in disrespecting a decorated combat veteran made him feel physically ill. Marcus Williams emerged from the latrine, already dressed in his ACUs for the day. He approached Jake's bunk with the careful movements of someone walking on thin ice. "Jake," he said quietly, We need to talk about what happens next." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew. Marcus glanced around the barracks, making sure they weren't being overheard. "Rodriguez was there last night. She saw everything. You think word hasn't already gotten back to the first sergeant, to the company commander?" Jake's face went pale. He hadn't thought about the potential official consequences of their behavior. Disrespect to an NCO was a serious offense under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Depending on how it was handled, it could result in anything from extra duty to an Article 15 non-judicial punishment that would go permanently on their records. "Maybe," Danny said hopefully. "Maybe Master Sergeant Henderson won't report it. He seemed more interested in teaching us a lesson than getting us in trouble." Tyler Brooks finally gave up pretending to sleep and sat up in his bunk. "That might be worse," he said quietly. "Think about it. If he doesn't report it officially, but everyone knows what happened, we're going to be known as the idiots who tried to bully a war hero. Our reputations are shot either way." The morning reveille sounded over the base's PA system, the familiar bugle call that had been waking soldiers for generations. Around them, the barracks came to life with the controlled chaos of soldiers preparing for another day of training and duty. But as the four friends went through their morning routine, shaving, brushing teeth, making their bunks to regulation standards, each of them was acutely aware that this wasn't just another day. They had crossed a line the night before, and there would be consequences. The first consequence came during morning formation, when First Sergeant Patricia Williams called out their names with particular emphasis. "Morrison, Chen, Brooks, Williams," she barked, her voice carrying the authority of 23 years in the Army. "Fall out. See me in my office after formation. Now." The rest of their platoon exchanged glances as the four soldiers stepped out of formation. Everyone had heard some version of the mess hall story by now, and the consensus was that these four had stepped in something they might not be able to clean off their boots. First Sergeant Williams was a compact woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen everything the Army had to offer. She'd served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and she had exactly 0 tolerance for soldiers who brought dishonor to the uniform. "Gentlemen," she said as the 4 soldiers stood at attention in front of her desk, "it has come to my attention that there was an incident in the mess hall last night involving Master Sergeant Henderson. Would one of you care to explain what happened?" Jake stepped forward slightly, accepting responsibility as he should have done from the beginning. "First Sergeant, I approached Master Sergeant Henderson in what I thought was a friendly manner. The conversation escalated, and I said things that were disrespectful to his rank and his service. There's no excuse for my behavior or for involving my squad mates in the situation." First Sergeant Williams studied Jake's face for a long moment, looking for signs of sincerity versus damage control. What she saw must have satisfied her, because her expression softened slightly. "Private Morrison, do you know who Master Sergeant Henderson is?" "Yes, First Sergeant. I learned last night that he's a decorated combat veteran with multiple tours in Afghanistan." "That's correct. What you probably don't know is that Master Sergeant Henderson has been recommended for the Sergeant Major Academy twice. He's turned it down both times because he prefers working directly with soldiers rather than climbing the administrative ladder." She leaned back in her chair. "He's also scheduled to retire in 3 months, which means he could have easily chosen to coast through his final assignment. Instead, he volunteers for every training exercise, mentors young NCOs in his spare time, and has never once used his seniority to avoid unpleasant duties." The weight of their mistake was settling over the 4 soldiers like a lead blanket. They had targeted exactly the wrong person. Not just a decorated veteran, but a soldier who embodied everything they were supposed to aspire to be. "Now," First Sergeant Williams continued, "Master Sergeant Henderson has not filed any formal complaints about last night's incident. In fact, when I called him this morning to discuss it, he specifically requested that I not take official action against you." The relief on their faces was palpable, but it was short-lived. "However," she continued, her voice taking on an edge that made them all stand a little straighter, "the fact that he chose to show you mercy doesn't mean there won't be consequences. Your behavior reflected poorly on this unit, on the uniform you wear, and on the oath you took when you enlisted." 3 days passed before any of the 4 soldiers worked up the courage to approach Master Sergeant Henderson again. During that time, they had endured the knowing looks and whispered comments of their fellow soldiers, completed extra duty assignments, courtesy of First Sergeant Williams, and spent considerable time reflecting on their behavior. It was Tyler Brooks who finally made the first move, approaching Bill's usual corner table in the mess hall during the dinner hour. Bill looked up from his book, a biography of Ulysses S. Grant this time, and nodded toward the empty chair across from him. "Evening, Private Brooks," Bill said simply. "How are you adjusting to Army life?" Tyler sat down carefully, as if the chair might collapse under the weight of his shame. "Master Sergeant, I wanted to apologize again for the other night, not just for my part in it, but for not stopping Jake when I should have." Bill closed his book and set it aside, giving Tyler his full attention. "That's the hardest part of leadership, son. Knowing when to speak up, even when it's not your responsibility, even when it might cost you friendships." "How do you learn that?" Tyler asked. "How do you know when to step in?" Bill considered the question, his pale blue eyes studying the young soldier's face. "Experience, mostly. Making mistakes and learning from them, but also by understanding what's really at stake in any given situation." "What do you mean?" "The other night, what was really at stake? My feelings? My ego?" Bill shook his head. "No. What was at stake was your development as soldiers, and by extension, your ability to serve effectively if you're ever called to combat. Jake was acting like a bully, but more importantly, he was acting like someone who doesn't understand what the uniform represents." Tyler nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. "Master Sergeant, can I ask you something? Why didn't you report us? We deserved whatever punishment we got." Bill's smile was patient. "Tell me, Private Brooks, what would have been the result if I'd filed a formal complaint?" Tyler thought for a moment. "We probably would have gotten Article 15s, lost rank, lost pay, maybe been restricted to base. And what would you have learned from that? That there are consequences for disrespecting NCOs? Maybe. Or maybe you would have learned that the Army has a formal punishment system, and if you're careful not to get caught, you can get away with things." Bill leaned forward slightly. "What did you actually learn from what happened?" Tyler was quiet for a long moment, really considering the question. "I learned that you can't judge people by appearances, that real strength doesn't need to announce itself, that the uniform means something and I was dishonoring it." "Exactly. And which lesson is more likely to make you a better soldier? The one you learned through punishment, or the one you learned through understanding?" Before Tyler could answer, Danny Chen appeared at their table, carrying his dinner tray and looking nervous. "Master Sergeant Henderson," Danny said, "would it be all right if I joined you? Tyler texted that you were willing to talk." Bill gestured to another chair. "Of course, Private Chen. In fact, why don't you text your other friends? I think it's time we had a proper conversation." 10 minutes later, Jake Morrison and Marcus Williams had reluctantly joined the group. The corner of the mess hall that had been the site of their confrontation 3 nights earlier was now hosting a very different kind of gathering. Bill looked at each of the 4 young men, noting the genuine remorse in their expressions. "Gentlemen, I want to start by saying that what happened the other night doesn't define who you are as soldiers or as men. It was a mistake, but mistakes can be valuable if you learn from them." Jake finally found his voice. "Master Sergeant, I've been thinking about what you said, about how respect is earned, not demanded. I realized I've been doing everything wrong since I got here." "How so?" "I thought being a soldier meant being tough, acting like I could handle anything, never showing weakness. But watching you the other night, you were the strongest person in that room, and you never raised your voice or tried to intimidate anyone." Bill nodded approvingly. "Strength comes in many forms, Private Morrison. Physical strength is important. You need to be able to carry your gear, help your battle buddies, perform under stress. But mental strength, emotional strength, moral strength, those are what separate good soldiers from great ones." Marcus Williams leaned forward. "Master Sergeant, would you mind telling us about Afghanistan? Not the war stories, but what it was really like, what it taught you." Bill was quiet for a moment, and the 4 soldiers could see him deciding how much to share. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. "Afghanistan taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. It taught me that leadership isn't about giving orders, it's about taking care of your people. And it taught me that the most important battles aren't always fought against the enemy." "What do you mean by that last part?" Danny asked. "Sometimes the hardest fight is against your own doubts, your own prejudices, your own desire to take the easy path instead of the right one." Bill looked at each of them in turn. "The other night you faced that kind of battle. You chose the easy path, picking on someone you thought was weak. but you have a chance to choose differently going forward. Tyler Brooks spoke up. Master Sergeant, would you be willing to mentor us, to help us become the kind of soldiers you'd be proud to serve with? Bill's smile reached his eyes for the first time since they'd known him. Private Brooks, I'd consider that an honor. But understand, real mentorship isn't about me telling you what to do. It's about me helping you develop the judgment to make good decisions on your own. Jake Morrison straightened in his chair. What would that look like? The mentorship, I mean. It would look like meeting here every week to talk about leadership, about military history, about what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. It would look like you taking on additional responsibilities and proving that you can handle them. And it would look like you becoming the kind of soldiers who stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The four young soldiers exchanged glances, and for the first time in days there was hope in their expressions. When do we start? Marcus asked. Bill chuckled, a warm sound that transformed his usually serious face. We just did, son. We just did. As conversations resumed around them in the mess hall, the five soldiers, one veteran nearing the end of his career and four young men just beginning theirs, continued talking long into the evening. They discussed leadership principles, shared stories about their backgrounds, and began to forge the kind of relationships that form the backbone of military service. Outside the windows, the Colorado night was clear and cold, with stars visible despite the base's lighting. But inside, around a simple table in a military mess hall, something important was taking root. The kind of mentorship that transforms not just individual soldiers, but the entire culture of service. 2 weeks later, the weekly mentoring sessions with Master Sergeant Henderson had become the highlight of Jake Morrison's military experience. What had started as an awkward attempt at redemption had evolved into something none of the four soldiers had expected, genuine learning that was changing how they approached every aspect of their service. The October air was crisp as Jake made his way to the company motor pool, where Bill had asked him to meet that morning. Instead of their usual mess hall gathering, today's lesson was going to be hands-on. Jake found Bill under the hood of a Humvee, his sleeves rolled up and grease on his hands, working alongside Specialist Rodriguez, no relation to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from the mess hall. Morning, Master Sergeant, Jake said, snapping to attention. Bill looked up from the engine compartment and shook his head with a slight smile. We're not in formation, Private Morrison, and we're about to get our hands dirty. Relax. Specialist Rodriguez, a 24-year-old mechanic from Los Angeles, grinned at Jake's formal posture. First time working with Master Sergeant Henderson? He's different from most senior NCOs. How so? Jake asked, genuinely curious. Most Master Sergeants wouldn't be caught dead actually turning wrenches, Rodriguez explained, handing Jake a socket wrench. They'd supervise from a distance, maybe check the work when it's done. Henderson gets right in there with us. Knows more about these engines than half the mechanics in the battalion. Bill emerged from under the hood, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Rodriguez, would you mind walking Private Morrison through the pre-combat inspection checklist? I want him to understand what keeps these vehicles running in hostile environments. For the next hour, Jake learned more about military vehicle maintenance than he had in all his previous training combined. But more importantly, he observed Bill's leadership style in action. The Master Sergeant didn't bark orders or assert his authority through rank. Instead, he worked alongside the junior soldiers, offered guidance when needed, and created an atmosphere where questions were encouraged rather than discouraged. Master Sergeant, Jake said during a brief break, can I ask you something? Always. Why are you doing this? The hands-on work, I mean. You could be in an office somewhere pushing paperwork. Bill leaned against the Humvee's fender, considering his answer. Tell me, Private Morrison, what do you think leadership looks like? Jake thought back to his previous assumptions. I used to think it meant being in charge, telling people what to do. And now? Now I think it's more complicated than that. Bill nodded. Leadership is about influence, not authority. Anyone can give orders. That's management. But getting people to follow you because they trust your judgment, because they believe in your mission, because they know you care about their welfare, that's leadership. Specialist Rodriguez looked up from the engine he was working on. Master Sergeant, remember that convoy mission last year, when the lead vehicle broke down in the middle of nowhere? Bill's expression grew more serious, but he nodded for Rodriguez to continue. We were 40 clicks from base. Radio was sketchy and the engine just died. Could have been an ambush, could have been mechanical failure. Most NCOs would have stayed with the command vehicle, let the mechanics figure it out. Jake found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story. But Master Sergeant Henderson grabbed a toolkit and crawled right under that vehicle in the dirt, in full battle gear, helping us diagnose the problem. Turned out to be a fuel line issue, something that would have taken hours to fix if we'd had to explain it over the radio to someone who wasn't there. Bill shrugged modestly. It was the practical thing to do. "No, sir," Rodriguez said firmly. "It was leadership. You showed us that the mission comes first, that rank doesn't make you too good to get dirty, and that you trust your soldiers enough to work alongside them even in potentially dangerous situations." Jake was beginning to understand something fundamental about the man who had become his mentor. Bill Henderson's authority didn't come from his rank or his decorations. It came from his character, demonstrated through countless small actions that proved he was worthy of the trust his soldiers placed in him. "Master Sergeant," Jake said slowly, "I think I've been approaching everything wrong since I enlisted." "How so?" "I thought being a soldier was about being tough, about proving I could handle anything. But watching you, listening to these stories, it's not about me at all, is it?" Bill's smile was approving. "What do you think it's about?" "It's about the mission. It's about the people serving beside you. It's about being someone others can count on, not someone they have to deal with." "Now you're getting it," Bill said. "The uniform doesn't make you special, Private Morrison. How you wear it does." Later that afternoon, Jake met up with Danny, Tyler, and Marcus at the base gym. The four had started working out together regularly, partly for physical fitness, but mostly because their shared experience with Master Sergeant Henderson had forged a bond between them that went deeper than friendship. "How was motor pool duty?" Danny asked, loading weights onto a barbell. "Eye-opening," Jake replied. "I'm starting to understand why everyone respects him so much. It's not just the combat experience, it's everything. The way he treats people, the way he approaches problems, the way he leads by example instead of by order." Tyler Brooks finished his set of push-ups and sat up, breathing hard. "You know what's crazy? 3 weeks ago we thought he was some washed-up old soldier who thought he was better than us. Now I can't imagine anyone I'd rather learn from." Marcus Williams nodded in agreement. "My dad always told me that the best teachers are the ones who make you want to be better than you are. Master Sergeant Henderson doesn't just teach us about being soldiers. He makes us want to be the kind of soldiers he'd be proud to serve with." "Speaking of which," Danny said, "did you guys hear about what happened with that new group of privates who arrived last week?" The others shook their heads. "Apparently a couple of them were mouthing off about the old-timers on base, making some of the same mistakes we made. But instead of waiting for them to embarrass themselves publicly, Rodriguez and some of the other NCOs pulled them aside and set them straight." Jake felt a flush of pride. "They're looking out for them the way Master Sergeant Henderson looked out for us." "Exactly. And you know what else? I heard First Sergeant Williams talking to the company commander yesterday. She said that our attitude adjustment has been noticed throughout the battalion. Other soldiers are starting to follow our example." Tyler grinned. "You mean we're accidentally becoming good influences?" "Not accidentally," Marcus corrected. "We're becoming the kind of soldiers Master Sergeant Henderson saw we could be, even when we couldn't see it ourselves." The following week brought an unexpected challenge that would test everything the four soldiers had learned from their mentor. It started with a phone call that Jake Morrison received from his younger brother back home in Ohio. "Jake," his brother Kevin's voice was tight with worry over the phone, "Dad's in the hospital. Heart attack. They think he's going to be okay, but, man, it's been scary." Jake felt his world shift. His father had always been larger than life in his mind, a construction foreman who could build anything, fix anything, handle any crisis. The idea of him lying helpless in a hospital bed was almost incomprehensible. "I need to come home," Jake said immediately. "I need to be there. The doctors say he's stable now, but Jake, he keeps asking for you, keeps saying he wants to talk to you about something important." After the call ended, Jake sat in the empty barracks, staring at his phone and trying to process the news. His father had never been the type to express emotion openly, and the idea that he was asking for his son suggested something serious beyond the medical emergency. That evening, Jake found Master Sergeant Henderson in his usual spot in the mess hall, reading a book about military history. But instead of his normal composed demeanor, Jake was visibly shaken. "Master Sergeant," Jake said, his voice tight, "I need to request emergency leave. My father had a heart attack." Bill immediately set down his book. and gave Jake his full attention. "Is he stable?" "Yes, sir. The doctors think he'll recover, but—" Jake's voice cracked slightly. "He's asking for me. My brother says it's important." "Of course it is," Bill said gently. "Have you talked to your platoon sergeant about leave?" "Not yet. I wanted to ask you. I value your advice. Should I go? We're supposed to have that field exercise next week, and I don't want to let the team down." Bill studied Jake's face for a moment, seeing the internal conflict between duty and family. "Private Morrison, what do you think I would do in your situation?" Jake considered the question, trying to apply the lessons he'd learned over the past few weeks. "You'd go home, because taking care of your family is part of being a good soldier, not separate from it." "Exactly. The army will survive without you for a week. Your father needs you now, and that's where you belong." Bill paused. "But there's something else I want you to think about." "What's that?" "Your relationship with your father. You've mentioned him a few times in our conversations, and I get the impression that things have been complicated between you two." Jake nodded reluctantly. "He wasn't happy when I enlisted. Said the military was for people who couldn't make it in the real world. We had a pretty big fight before I left for basic training." Bill's expression was understanding but serious. "Jake, I'm going to tell you something that might be difficult to hear, but it's important. When people face their own mortality, they often realize that pride and old arguments don't matter as much as they thought they did. You think that's why he's asking for me? I think your father is probably scared, and he wants to make sure that if something happens to him, his relationship with his son is right. The question is, are you prepared for that conversation?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. I'm still angry about some of the things he said." "That's understandable, but anger is a luxury you might not be able to afford right now. Your father is lying in a hospital bed, probably reflecting on his life and his relationships. He's reached out to you, which took courage on his part. The question is whether you have the courage to meet him halfway." Bill leaned forward, his voice taking on the gentle authority that had become familiar to Jake over the past month. "One of the hardest lessons of military service is learning when to fight and when to make peace. This isn't a battle worth winning, son. This is a relationship worth saving." The next morning, Jake was on a plane to Ohio with emergency leave approved. Danny, Tyler, and Marcus had seen him off, promising to take notes on anything important that happened during the field exercise he would miss. But as Jake sat in the cramped airline seat, watching the landscape pass below, he found himself thinking about something Master Sergeant Henderson had said during one of their earlier conversations. "The uniform doesn't make you special. How you wear it does." Now Jake was beginning to understand that being a good soldier wasn't just about what he did while wearing the uniform. It was about carrying the values of service, honor, and sacrifice into every aspect of his life. It was about being the kind of man who could serve his country with distinction and still be a good son, a good brother, a good friend. When he arrived at the hospital in Columbus, Jake found his father awake, but looking frailer than he'd ever seen him. The construction foreman, who had always seemed indestructible, was connected to monitors and IV lines, his face pale against the white hospital pillows. "Jake," his father said, and there was something in his voice, relief, maybe, or gratitude, that Jake had never heard before. "Hey, Dad, how are you feeling?" His father gestured dismissively at the medical equipment surrounding him. "Like I've been hit by a truck, but the doctors say I'll live to see you graduate from this army thing of yours." Jake sat down in the chair beside the bed, suddenly unsure what to say. The anger and resentment he'd been carrying seemed insignificant in the face of his father's vulnerability. "Dad, about what we said before I left." "Stop," his father interrupted, holding up a weak hand. "I called you here because I owe you an apology, not the other way around." He took a shaky breath. "Lying here for the past few days, thinking I might not make it, it made me realize how stupid I've been." Jake felt his eyes beginning to water, but he kept his composure the way Master Sergeant Henderson had taught him, by focusing on what was important rather than what was easy. "You weren't stupid, Dad. You were scared for me." His father nodded slowly. "Your brother showed me some of your letters, the training you're doing, the responsibility they're giving you. I was wrong about the military, Jake. I was wrong about a lot of things." He looked directly at his son. "I'm proud of you. So I should have said that a long time ago." As Jake sat there holding his father's hand, he realized that this was what Master Sergeant Henderson had been trying to teach him all along. Real strength wasn't about winning arguments or proving points. It was about having the courage to forgive, to love, to put relationships before pride. 3 days later, when Jake returned to Fort Carson, he found Master Sergeant Henderson waiting for him in the mess hall with a cup of coffee and a patient smile. "How's your father?" Bill asked. "Better, we're better." Jake sat down, feeling like he had crossed some invisible threshold in his development as both a soldier and a man. "Master Sergeant, I wanted to thank you for the advice, but also for helping me understand what really matters." Bill nodded approvingly. "That's what good soldiers do for each other, Jake. We look out for one another, in uniform and out. Welcome back." As Jake looked around the mess hall, at the soldiers sharing meals and stories, at the camaraderie that had become so important to him, he realized that he had finally found his place in the army, not as someone trying to prove his toughness or demand respect, but as someone committed to serving something bigger than himself, while never forgetting the people who mattered most. The transformation that had begun with a moment of shame had become something much more valuable, the foundation of the kind of soldier and the kind of man he wanted to be for the rest of his life. November brought the first serious snowfall to the Colorado Rockies, blanketing Fort Carson in a pristine white that transformed the utilitarian military base into something almost beautiful. But the real transformation was happening among the soldiers themselves, as the influence of Master Sergeant Henderson's mentorship began to spread far beyond the original 4 recruits. It started small, as meaningful changes often do. Jake Morrison, now carrying himself with the quiet confidence that comes from genuine self-respect rather than manufactured bravado, had begun volunteering to help newer soldiers adjust to military life. When a fresh group of privates arrived from basic training, instead of seeing them as targets for intimidation, he saw them as younger brothers who needed guidance. "Remember your first week here?" Danny Chen asked one evening as they watched Jake patiently explaining base procedures to a nervous 18-year-old from rural Kentucky. They were sitting in the common area of their barracks, where Jake had set up an impromptu orientation session for the new arrivals. Tyler Brooks nodded, remembering his own confusion and anxiety during those early days. "I was so scared of doing something wrong, of looking stupid in front of the older soldiers. And instead of helping us, we just tried to look tough," Marcus Williams added. "Makes you wonder how different things might have been if someone had taken the time to actually help us instead of just judging us." They watched as Jake demonstrated the proper way to set up wall lockers according to regulation, his voice patient and encouraging rather than critical. The new soldiers were actually relaxing, asking questions instead of trying to pretend they understood everything. "You know what's crazy?" Danny said. "Jake's becoming the kind of NCO I want to follow, and he's not even an NCO yet." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been observing Jake's impromptu training session from the doorway. "Morrison," she called out, "can I see you for a minute?" Jake excused himself from the group of new soldiers and approached the staff sergeant, automatically coming to a position of attention. "Relax, Morrison," Rodriguez said with a slight smile. "I wanted to talk to you about what I just witnessed. That was good leadership out there." "Thank you, Staff Sergeant. I was just trying to help them adjust. I know what you were doing, and I know where you learned to do it." She glanced toward the mess hall, where Master Sergeant Henderson would be having his usual quiet dinner. 3 months ago, you were a completely different soldier. The change has been noted by everyone in the chain of command. Jake felt a flush of pride, but also a deep sense of responsibility. "Master Sergeant Henderson showed me what real leadership looks like. I'm just trying to pass it on." "That's exactly what good NCOs do," Rodriguez said approvingly. "Which brings me to why I wanted to talk to you. Have you given any thought to your long-term goals in the Army?" "I've been thinking about it more lately," Jake admitted. "I used to just think about getting through my enlistment. Now I'm starting to think about what kind of career I could have, what kind of leader I could become." Rodriguez nodded. "I'm putting you in for Warrior Leader course next spring. It's the first step toward becoming an NCO. But understand, the rank is just recognition of something you've already become. You're already leading, Morrison. The Army just needs to make it official." That evening, Jake found Master Sergeant Henderson in the base library, a quiet corner of the community center where Bill often went to read when he wanted to avoid the crowds in the mess hall. He was absorbed in a biography of General George Marshall, taking notes in a small notebook, with the careful handwriting of someone who valued learning. "Master Sergeant," Jake said quietly, not wanting to disturb other readers, "could I talk to you for a minute?" Bill looked up and smiled, closing his book after marking his place. "Of course. How did your session with the new soldiers go?" Jake was no longer surprised that Bill knew about activities he hadn't directly witnessed. The Master Sergeant seemed to have an awareness of everything that happened on base that affected soldier welfare. Really well, actually. They asked good questions, and I think I was able to help them feel more confident about the basics. Jake paused. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez talked to me afterward. She's recommending me for Warrior Leader course. Bill's smile widened. That's outstanding, Jake. How do you feel about it? Proud, nervous, grateful. Jake sat down across from his mentor. Master Sergeant, I keep thinking about that night in the mess hall when I first made such an ass of myself. If someone had told me then that I'd be recommended for NCO training within 6 months, I would have thought they were crazy. What changed? Bill asked, though Jake suspected he already knew the answer. I did. You helped me understand that being a soldier isn't about being the toughest guy in the room or demanding respect through intimidation. It's about serving something bigger than yourself and taking care of the people around you. Bill nodded approvingly. And now you're teaching that same lesson to other soldiers. That's how real change happens in the military. One leader developing another, who develops another, and so on. Is that what you've been doing your whole career? Developing other leaders? Bill was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. It's what every good NCO does, whether they realize it or not. But you've made it particularly rewarding, Jake. You and the other 3 have reminded me why I love this job even after 35 years. Master Sergeant, Jake said carefully, I heard rumors that you're retiring soon. Bill's expression grew more serious. December 15th. 35 years and 8 months of active duty. It's time. Jake felt an unexpected pang of loss. The idea of Master Sergeant Henderson not being there, not being available for guidance and wisdom, was harder to accept than he'd anticipated. What will you do after retirement, I mean? I'm not entirely sure yet. I've got a pension and some savings. Maybe I'll teach, maybe work with veteran organizations. The important thing is that I'll have done my job here, helped prepare the next generation of leaders to carry on without me. We're not ready, Jake said without thinking. Bill chuckled warmly. You're more ready than you think. And besides, good leadership development never really ends. You'll keep learning, keep growing, keep helping others do the same. That's the beauty of it. The process continues long after the original mentor is gone. Meanwhile, across the base, the influence of Bill's mentorship was manifesting in ways both subtle and profound. Danny Chen had started tutoring struggling soldiers in basic mathematics and computer skills during his off-duty hours. Tyler Brooks had begun organizing weekend hiking trips to help build camaraderie and physical fitness among the junior enlisted. Marcus Williams had volunteered to help with the base food drive, coordinating donations and distribution with the methodical approach he'd learned from watching Bill handle complex logistics. But perhaps most importantly, all 4 of them had begun to embody the quiet professionalism and genuine care for others that they'd observed in their mentor. They weren't performing leadership. They were living it, day by day, interaction by interaction. First Sergeant Williams had noticed the change, not just in the 4 original troublemakers, but in the entire atmosphere of the company. Disciplinary problems were down, morale was up. Soldiers were looking out for each other with an attention and care that she hadn't seen in years. It's remarkable, she told the company commander during their weekly briefing. It started with Henderson mentoring those 4 knuckleheads who tried to bully him, but now it's spread throughout the entire unit. They're mentoring others, who are mentoring others. It's like watching leadership development in real time. Captain Martinez, the company commander, had also noticed the change. Do you think it's something we can replicate in other units? I think it's already happening, First Sergeant Williams replied. Word has gotten around about what Master Sergeant Henderson did, how he handled that confrontation, how he turned potential disciplinary problems into some of our best soldiers. Other senior NCOs are taking notice, trying to apply the same principles, which are, treat soldiers like human beings with potential, not problems to be managed. Lead by example instead of by authority. And always focus on developing the person, not just correcting the behavior. December 15th dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that makes the Rocky Mountains look close enough to touch. It was Master Sergeant William Henderson's last day of active duty, and Fort Carson was preparing to honor 35 years of distinguished service. The retirement ceremony was scheduled for 1400 hours in the Post Chapel, a simple but dignified venue that could accommodate the surprising number of soldiers who had requested permission to attend. Word of Bill's retirement had spread throughout the base, and what was originally planned as a small ceremony for immediate colleagues had grown into something much larger. Jake Morrison stood in front of his wall locker, carefully adjusting his dress blue uniform. As the senior soldier among Bill's original mentees, he had been chosen to speak at the ceremony, an honor that both thrilled and terrified him. The speech he'd written and rewritten a dozen times lay on his bunk, but he'd memorized every word. "You ready for this?" Danny Chen asked, adjusting his own uniform with the precision they'd all learned to take pride in. "As ready as I can be," Jake replied. "I just hope I can do justice to what he's meant to all of us." Tyler Brooks and Marcus Williams joined them, all four soldiers now carrying themselves with the quiet confidence and mutual respect that had become their trademark. They had become the kind of soldiers that other soldiers looked up to, not because they demanded it, but because they'd earned it through consistent acts of service and leadership. "Have you guys seen the guest list?" Marcus asked. "It's not just people from Carson. There are soldiers coming from Peterson Air Force Base, from the National Guard units in Denver, even some retired guys who served with him in Afghanistan." "Makes sense," Tyler said. "A career like his touches a lot of lives over 35 years. They made their way across the base toward the chapel, joining streams of other soldiers in dress uniforms converging on the ceremony. The December air was sharp but invigorating, and Jake found himself thinking about how different this felt from his early days at Fort Carson, how much more connected he felt to the institution, to the mission, to his fellow soldiers. Inside the chapel, they found seats in the front section, reserved for Bill's immediate colleagues and mentees. The building was filling rapidly, with soldiers from across the installation taking their places. At the front, a small podium had been set up next to an easel displaying Bill's official military portrait and a summary of his awards and decorations. As Jake looked around at the assembled soldiers, young privates, seasoned NCOs, commissioned officers, he was struck by something he'd never noticed before. There was a quality in the faces of the soldiers who had served longest, a quiet dignity and sense of purpose that he now recognized as the mark of true professional soldiers. It was the same quality he'd first seen in Master Sergeant Henderson, and that he hoped he was developing in himself. The ceremony began with the traditional military formalities, the presentation of colors, the invocation, remarks from the battalion commander. But when it came time for Jake to speak, the chapel fell into a respectful silence that seemed to acknowledge the significance of the moment. Jake approached the podium with steady steps, his prepared speech in his hand, but his eyes focused on Master Sergeant Henderson, who sat in the front row with the composed dignity that had become so familiar. "Distinguished guests, fellow soldiers," Jake began, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel's acoustics. "I stand before you today not as someone who has known Master Sergeant Henderson for decades, but as someone whose life was fundamentally changed by knowing him for just a few months." He paused, looking out at the assembled soldiers, many of whom knew the story of his first encounter with Bill. 4 months ago, I was a different soldier and a different person. I was someone who confused aggression with strength, noise with leadership, and demanding respect with earning it. I was exactly the kind of soldier that Master Sergeant Henderson has spent 35 years patiently transforming into something better. A few knowing smiles appeared in the audience, including one from Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had witnessed the original confrontation. Master Sergeant Henderson could have handled our disrespect through official channels. He could have used his rank and authority to simply punish us and move on. Instead, he chose to see our potential rather than just our problems. He chose to teach rather than to punish, to mentor rather than to manage. Jake's voice grew stronger as he continued, drawing from the confidence that months of genuine growth had given him. But this ceremony isn't just about thanking Master Sergeant Henderson for what he's done, it's about committing to continue what he's started. Because the true measure of a leader isn't what they accomplish during their career, but what continues after they're gone. He looked directly at Bill, whose eyes were bright with pride, and something that might have been emotion. "Master Sergeant Henderson taught me that real leadership isn't about position or authority. It's about influence. It's about helping people become better than they thought they could be. It's about serving something bigger than yourself, while never forgetting that the most important mission is taking care of the soldiers around you." Jake paused, aware that he was speaking not just to the soldiers in the chapel, but to future soldiers who would inherit the legacy of leaders like Bill Henderson. Today we're not just honoring 35 years of distinguished service, we're celebrating a philosophy of leadership that will continue to shape soldiers for generations to come. Because Master Sergeant Henderson didn't just serve his country, he helped ensure that others would be capable of serving it long after his retirement. As Jake concluded his remarks and returned to his seat, the chapel erupted in sustained applause. But more than the applause, what struck him was the sense of shared purpose in the room, hundreds of soldiers united in their commitment to the values and principles that Bill Henderson had embodied throughout his career. The ceremony concluded with the traditional retirement honors, the presentation of awards, the folding of the flag, the final salute. But as the formal proceedings ended and soldiers began to move toward the reception in the adjacent community center, Jake felt Master Sergeant Henderson's hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," Bill said simply. "That was everything I hoped it would be. Thank you, Master Sergeant, for everything, for seeing something in us that we couldn't see in ourselves." Bill smiled, the expression warm and paternal. "You know, Jake, people often ask me what I'm most proud of in 35 years of service. The answer isn't any specific mission or decoration or assignment. It's moments like this, watching soldiers become the leaders they were meant to be." As they walked together toward the reception, Jake realized that this wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning, the start of his own journey as a leader, armed with the lessons and example of someone who had dedicated his life to developing others. The afternoon winter sun was setting behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. But inside the community center, the warmth of camaraderie and shared purpose created an atmosphere that transcended the cold December day. Soldiers who had served with Bill throughout his career shared stories and memories, each one adding to the picture of a man who had made the Army, and the soldiers in it, better through decades of quiet, consistent leadership. As Jake looked around the room, at Danny, Tyler, and Marcus, who were deep in conversation with some of Bill's other mentees, at the senior NCOs who had learned from Bill's example, at the young soldiers who were just beginning to understand what real leadership looked like, he realized that Master Sergeant Henderson's greatest achievement wasn't any single act of heroism or moment of glory. It was this, a room full of soldiers who had been touched by his example, who carried his values forward in their own service, and who would pass those same lessons on to the next generation. It was a legacy that would continue long after the ceremony was over, long after the retirement party had ended, and long after Master Sergeant William Henderson had hung up his uniform for the final time. In the end, that was what true leadership looked like. Not a destination, but a journey that continued through everyone who had been privileged to learn from it. And as Jake shook hands with his mentor one last time, he understood that the real work was just beginning.